We're honored to have Professor Ronan McDonald with us today. Ronan McDonald holds the Jerry Higgins Chair of Irish Studies at the University of Melbourne. He has published widely in the field of modern Irish literature and also in the history of criticism and the value of humanities. His books include the Cambridge Introduction to Samuel Beckett, The Death of the Critic, and a magnificent edited collection of essays called The Values of Literary Studies. Ronan, thank you for accepting our invitation.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for extending the invitation.
Thank you. So to begin with, and for the benefit of our audience, how do you define post-critique? Is it a distanciation from critique? Is it anti-critique, or is it simply critique reconfigured?
It's a very good question. And of course, all these terms, particularly the newer ones, there's a lot of blurring at the edges as to what constitutes post-critique or not. It hasn't yet kind of congealed into a term that can have a neat dictionary definition. Particularly terms which come out of a critical idiom like this, the critical idioms, we start getting a term, often a post term. And I think we think, for example, when I was a student, a term that we hear much less these days, postmodernism or postmodern. And people were always trying to interrogate that post word. Does it mean after? Or does it mean anti? Is it a continuation? Is it a repudiation? Is it is it temporal? Does it have to do with time? Should we see it as simply a question of something which succeeds temporally, or some other paradigm? And there isn't any clear definition of post-critique around those areas, and it's used in different ways. But I think that nonetheless, those caveats aside, let's see if we can kind of give your viewers a sense of what we mean. I think people started using post-critique probably around the last 10 years, maybe, though some of the seminal articles or interventions which people point to came a little bit earlier than that. For example, a key moment would have been Eve Kozowski-Sedgwick's essay on paranoid reading. We got Bruno, that's I think about 2004, I could be wrong. Bruno Latour's essay a little bit later, Has Critique Run Out of Steam? And then we got other essays around that time, other interventions. And then I think it must be about 5 years since Rita Felsky's The Limits of Critique, where the word and a collected essay, a collection of essays she did with Elizabeth Anker called Critique and Post-Critiques. The word has come around more and more. So, okay, those are its origins. It's interesting that, we think of people, of someone like Eve Kozowski-Sedgwick, so a key figure for queer theory. And it's significant, I think, that it came out of, the post-critique came out of a movement which was profoundly wedded to critical methods, critical theories. And indeed, I think the same is true for Latour and Felsky. These are figures who are enmeshed in the methods and presumptions of critique. So one idea of critique is not just not post, not just not anti, but an excessive critique, when critique turns itself upon itself. Something happened early in the 21st century where this method, critique, which I haven't defined because it's very difficult to define, but let's call it a questioning, a skepticism. Sometimes people talk about skepticism when they're writing against it, an urge to unveil, to debunk, a real critical word, and expose that which lies beneath. It's very much concerned with the latent rather than the manifest. And its roots are probably within intellectual life in the humanities, in Marxism and psychoanalysis, both of which seek to get under, to find out what the patient is really being motivated by, to find out what the text is really being motivated by. The text, the novel presents itself as this story, but what sort of ideologies, what sort of social pressures and conflicts are occurring underneath? Those are the methods of critique, and they are, I think, often quite political. So post-critique, I think, really does emerge from critique and can be understood as critique turning on itself, biting its own tail. I think some of the post-critique manifestos, in my view, some of the writers might disagree, Rita Felsky might disagree, but I think they actually come across as very critical. They come across as using the language of critique against critique. However, what does it go about to try to do? Well, if we read those three figures I've mentioned, there is, I suppose, evident in all three is a certain desire to get over a tone and an attitude that they detect in literary criticism and writings of criticism, which after Paul Ricoeur is called the hermeneutic of suspicion. It also involves a skepticism, a cynicism perhaps, a disdain for affect. One doesn't want to get too affective, one doesn't want to get too enthusiastic. One should be like a doctor diagnosing a text or a detective trying to find out what's really going on, not somebody who is involved or attached. So even though critique adopts a posture of impartiality and distance, you mentioned distance at the start there, Morteza, I think that's a key relation between the critical critic and the text, one of distance and scrutiny. They kind of find, some of these post-critics find that inadequate to what texts actually do to readers, which is to move them, to give pleasure, to form attachments and enchantments. And they want to give, in their various ways, more room for a hermeneutic of reparation, another Ricoeurian term, which Sedgwick uses, more space for reparation, more space for what texts can do, rather than for them to be pinned like specimens and revealed in all their ideological shame quite often. So post-critique moves in the direction of owning or acknowledging or trying to be less disdainful or rejecting of our attachments and our enchantments.
Thank you very much. That was a great description. It was actually a wrap up of the whole course that I'm trying to run. I'm glad you mentioned the word enchantment here, because as you mentioned, post-critique is usually marked by a disavowal of suspicious reading or hermeneutics of suspicion. And in a way, it's a revival or a celebration of enchantment. So if that's the case, how else can readers engage with literary works without running the risk of sentimentalization of literary works or literature?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, well, you've got enchantment and you've got sentimentalization. Enchantment is a dangerous word, isn't it, in English, because we think of enchantment as having a strongly negative connotation, even though it has a positive, depending on context. You could say, oh, I'm enchanted. In French, they say enchanté when you meet somebody. I'm enchanted. It's a positive thing. I'm moved. I've had an affect. But there's also enchantment as to be lured, to be brainwashed, to be caught up. We think, for example, of Rossetti's poem. Is it Christina Rossetti, The Goblin Market?
Yeah.
Christina Rossetti's poem, The Goblin Market, of the woman who gets enchanted by these goblins. And we get that throughout a lot. And we think of Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare's play, about people actually, enchantment means to lose, to be enchanted means to some extent to lose one's sense, to lose oneself. So there is that sense of a wariness of enchantment. But I think at the same time, what a post-critique, someone would argue from post-critique, is that if we don't recognize the emotional and affective work that literature does on us, which isn't really generally a enchantment whereby we read Jane Austen and mistake our reality. We don't generally think we're all of a sudden in 19th century or early 19th century England in the provinces. But we enter for a moment, we had the experience of getting lost in a novel, which is one of the reasons we do it, is something that critique doesn't have any space for.
Mm-hmm.
Postcritique is just trying to acknowledge it and bring it into the discussion and realizing that our reality is made up of um, uh, imaginative frames as
Mm-hmm.
well as an unimaginative one. I mean, Coleridge talks about the suspension of disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we do suspend disbelief. We don't, if someone interrupts us when we're reading, we don't think we're in Narnia, we realize we're not. But the
Mm-hmm.
pleasures that come from, I'm just talking about novels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just talking about novels. So I don't think that enchantment necessarily if you want to use that word, there are probably better words. I don't think, I think Felsky's favorite word would be attachment, which is both our imaginative stakes of reading, which is why we all read, most of us, and that which gives us pleasure or moves us or expands us or uplifts us in some way, to give that the recognition in which we are not always cleverer and smarter than that which we are reading.
Mm-hmm.
And our role is not always to unmask and debunk, but that reading can be something that we can learn from, and it can be a foray into the unknown, which I think outside of universities is often the way people read, and they read with a certain humility. And I think post-critique often does actually bring a certain kind of humility towards literary works which have survived the test of time and which, speak meaningfully in multiple ways across generations. I think it's probably appropriate to have a certain humility when reading such works. So I've skirted around there talking about enchantment and sentimentality. The final thing I would say about this, the danger of sentimentality, I mean, to my mind, there has been, if we think of critique, and I said at the start that critique is a hard, it's not really a natural kind, it's hard to define. And the truth is that which is post-critique, I talked about post-critique as emerging from extreme critique, being a critique of critique, just as there is critique in post-critique, particularly these essays and manifestos, equally there is post-critique and critique. I mean, critique is not, it's easy to caricature, and it has been caricatured by its opponents. And some of its more vulgar and imitative practitioners deserve the caricature. But at its best, it's not simply one of a continual suspicion, continual skepticism, continual paranoia. It's more creative than that at best practitioners. We might think of somebody like, Frederick Jameson, key Marxist theory is more subtle than I think the caricature, far more than the caricature of that detective psychoanalyst metaphors which he uses would indicate. However, I do think that, the entry of critical theory as kind of a trans-humanities thing, late 60s, early 70s, took literary studies in a particular direction. And my own view would be that lots of productive things came from that intersection, but when there's a whole 60 years of institutional literary studies which came before, which had a whole array of practices, which you wouldn't really regard as critical in the same way, but nonetheless certainly couldn't be described as sentimental. There's all types of tough-minded approaches which are, approach texts in a different way than that critical spirit that the likes of Felsky is indicting, which we could productively reconnect with. I would point, for example, at Joseph North's recent short history of the institution, where he argues the case that literary studies could be reinvigorated by reconnecting to its earlier generations, which to some extent were toppled, particularly I.A. Richards is his hero, but one of the founders of the discipline. So I don't think the alternative to a kind of doctrinaire, paranoid, pleasure disliking project of ideological debunking, the only alternative that is sentimental reading. Sorry, that's another very long answer to your question, but
that was actually covered the next question that I wanted to answer, which I wanted to pose, which was, if post-critique is like an obeisance to aesthetic values, is it a revival of a Matthew Arnoldean sense of culture, or setting up an elite literature, which I guess you covered in your answer in a way which that is not the
Well,
case.
I give a briefer gloss
Yeah.
on that question. I don't think that. I mean, I really think that values are inescapable of one sort or another. I think we can push them down and pretend that we are doing something wholly neutral and impartial, but values are going to resurface because we have to. Not least, we have to choose what to read. We have to choose what to teach. The question is, what are the criteria of your selection? What are the criteria of your evaluation? I think that there probably, and this could be, I think, linked to post-critique. There has certainly, I think, been within literary studies far more a far more open and hospitable attitude towards the category of literature and the literary than there was, say, when I was an undergrad. But that doesn't always call itself post-critique. But certainly, I think in the new millennium, people have not seen literature as a kind of a suspect Arnoldean tool full of kind of reactionary ideology used to prop up a very Eurocentric and patriarchal idea, an imperialist idea of culture, which I think might have been presented to me when I was an undergraduate, say in the early 90s. I think it's changed since that, and it's changed not because people want to restore the Arnoldean or Leavisites. I mean, Leavis being the kind of the key inheritor of Arnold. Much though I think we shouldn't be too quick to discard those figures as reactionary bogeymen. I don't think either of them were. They were socially liberal, and certainly Leavis came from a very socially liberal and wanted an inclusive idea of literature, despite his very restrictive idea of the canon. But I think one of the changes that has happened in this new hospitability to the idea of the literary is that we no longer think of it as frozen object, that we have one object that is kind of outside time. We think of literary value as being an event rather than an object. And we can see this, for example, in all types of contemporary thinkers and theorists, Anglophone and non-Anglophone. I mean, you can see it, for example, in some of Paul Ricoeur's work on the aesthetic. And this is coming from a very radical politics. We can see it in someone like Charlie Altieri and Berkeley, or Derek Attridge's work, who writes The Singularity of Literature. So the idea of value and the idea of has, to some extent, been rescued by linking it to the notion of readerly experience. So I have, it's not that I have a book, look at that book on my shelf up there high, leather bound, it's very valuable, it's part of the canon, don't you touch it. Its literary value happens through the experience of reading, and it's phenomenological. Now, perhaps the bogey in the room here is how we keep, that idea of value seems to kind of keep value, and it's my experience, but it seems to eschew the question of hierarchy, which because I can have an amazingly phenomenological experience, reading Dan Brown, the bestseller, and you could have it reading, and who's to say one is better than the other? And that's a much more embarrassing question, a more difficult question for people in literary studies to answer, even though they all have their preferences, because they want to avoid looking like a Kantian or looking like they want to establish hierarchies in the Arnoldean sense. Though I think they have to act as if there are, and most people recognize that certain modes of literature are probably worth repay in-depth study more than others, for whatever reason. But something which was pretty obvious to most people before 1968, but which is almost unsayable now. So I think some idea of the canon, the canon will be much more expanded. It won't be Leavisite. But ultimately, and I think this is even more the case in the digital age, because a digital age means that inclusion is not a problem.
Yeah.
You can read anything online. You can read the most obscure, forgotten work. But our lives are not infinite. Our reading lives are certainly not. So we have to make selections, and we have to steer people towards, encourage people. It doesn't have to necessarily be exclusive or intolerant or static or very, very, very kind of restrictive and tight in a Leavisite way. But we do, I think, my own view, and I suspect it would be a very unpopular view amongst a lot of my colleagues, is that at some level, hierarchy is inevitable, and we would be better to own it.
That reminds me of Ezra Pound's sentence, life is short, art is long. And we have to choose what we want to read.
Exactly. And I mean, I think we could also say, because there is this idea that, I tried to reclaim Arnold and Leavis a little bit simply from being right-wing bogeymen. I mean, people, if we think of people, the source of critique in its modern sense, we talk about the Frankfurt School. Adorno had no problem making the most fastidious and punctilious aesthetic discriminations and evaluations and hierarchies, many of which now look, well, we kind of wish maybe he'd spent a bit more time listening to jazz, which he dismissed, or his big kind of defenses of Schoenberg over Stravinsky and so on. But my point being that people on a radical left-wing Marxist politics can be not just evaluative but hierarchical too, and indeed the roots of critique is in aesthetic hierarchy. I mean, aesthetic hierarchy, this notion of the aesthetic, which has been so difficult for literary studies to handle in the last few decades, is there at the roots of critique too.
Thank you very much. Great answer. Thank you. My next question would more relate to the current political or economic zeitgeist with regards to humanities and critique. So in recent years, there has been this resurgence of unabashedly ferocious enemies of critique in general, or post-structuralism or Marxism in particular. And some of them are highly esteemed literary scholars, such as Brian Boyd that we talked about earlier, and some not really very qualified people, but they're more like public celebrity, public intellectuals who knowingly or unknowingly have mischaracterized critique, and they have been met with unprecedented success, and they've created their own cult of personality. And I'm thinking of the likes of Jordan Peterson or Steven Pinker to some extent. So do you think that post-structuralists new Marxist fixation of negation and critique, coupled with their abstruse language or cultural relativity, was partially responsible for this popularity of anti-critique rhetorics?
That's a really interesting question and a really big one. Let me try to kind of go back to the start about kind of the anti-critique. I mean, I mentioned that what happened in the humanities with the entrance of a certain critical theory really kind of, I suppose, we could see it coming from a couple of different directions. The first one would be the development of cultural studies in Britain, which came from students of Leavis, actually. I mentioned Leavis' social mission, but people like Raymond Williams, really maybe the most significant Marxist literary theorist of the 20th century in England, kind of decided that we have to call culture ordinary. And there was a big movement about kind of studying, not studying these literary texts in a sacred way, but flattening them into cultural production, and then cultural studies linking with cultural studies being born and using anthropological methods to study culture as a whole form. Quite scienticized, and it went to Birmingham. I mean, in cultural studies kind of took a lot of energy away from literary studies and had an avowedly Marxist agenda, though it evolved in different ways. I don't want to caricature it, but it really, I think, for a certain period, looked as if English might morph into cultural studies. The other kind of, that happened really in the 60s. In the late 60s, we had the influence of French theory and structuralism, in particularly in the linguistics turn. So, I mean, there was a kind of even when these things came, there was a branch of literary studies which was very hostile to them. So there was always people who were anti-theory. There were regularly, and people didn't talk about critique or critical theory, it was theory. And often theory was caricatured. And things like the cultural studies branch that I mentioned in England and the French theory, linguistic theory branch were molded together as this new thing called theory. So you had a continual stream of sometimes quite cogent, polemics against the direction that literary theory was going. Sometimes preserving in arguing that it was toppling our canon and our hierarchies, and that was a bad thing. I suppose an example of a figure who kind of within literary studies, a very estimable figure who just died, I think last year, the year before, was Harold Bloom, who wrote very important books about Yeats and so on in the 70s, but became a kind of conservative Mandarin against literary theory and in defense of the canon in his final
resentments, right?
Yes, resentment. He used that, and he had a lot of popular purchase, probably less purchase within the academy itself, but he certainly had an audience outside it. But there were other major figures in the US, in the world of letters, who would have been anti-theory. I think of someone like Saul Bellow, for example, and it's complicated, and we're skirting over big issues here because postmodernist fiction is happening at the same, in the 80s as well, and that's in some way allied to it. So look, just broadly put, with theory comes anti-theory. Theory is never a very satisfactory term because it brings in so many different movements. But there is a kind of a sense of a methodological and disciplinary turf war within the university, which doesn't map on completely, but which is related to wider cultural battles within America and England. Spills over into some of the broadsheets and cultural magazines between what we call the culture wars about what's the role of are the universities been taken over by the left and we're not getting sufficient diversity? What about what's the role of feminism and all these types of things, familiar and old stuff, which are kind of often more heat than light when they're put into a public realm, I would say. So your question was the kind of the opposition within. So certainly within this literary studies, there has been anti-theoretical writing. I think there's also been, it's probably important to remember for you, and I think it's often forgotten for you and your kind of listeners, watchers, that literary studies has always had a branch which just does scholarship and which remains kind of unperturbed by a lot of these theoretical storms, and it still does. One of the roots of literary studies is in philology, which is the studying languages and doing, textual bibliographical scholarship, whereby you look at the different drafts of work, or you look at, you try to source, you try to translate, you look at different, you do disciplined, scholarly, philological work. Now that has always been there, doing new editions of major writers and minor writers. Yeah. And it's kind of sometimes coexisted. So we go back before criticism, and North makes this point, but so do a lot of people, about we think of theory coming along and disrupting. There was always a dialogical presence within our discipline between criticism and scholarship. And criticism was almost a bit suspect because criticism by the scholars, because criticism wasn't always falsifiable in the sense Karl Popper gives us. Whereas the scholars were doing things with objects, they were doing things with manuscripts, and it was empirical, it had rigor, It was systematic. So that was always kind of going on. And that branch of scholarship has had a new fillip in recent years with the digital humanities, with genetic criticism. And we can see someone doing pretty serious scholarship, like distant reading, Franco Moretti and people like that, in which it's looking at observable evidence. And there's lots of things which are looking at observable evidence. I think that effort for literature studies to be scientific or to have an observable side has always been with us. Because criticism has always been a little bit, that when I say criticism, that act whereby we read and interpret without anything else. So it's always had an anxiety about the personal or the subjective element. So the various movements within the criticism side, not the scholarship side, as it's developed within the discipline, have sought to expunge it. I mean, what else is formalism or new criticism? We must get rid of the affective fallacy, as they call it, and the authorial fallacy. We look at the words on the page. That formalism, which dominant literary studies, is an effort to make it rigorous or quasi-scientific. Then we've even some of the intersections between literary studies and semiotics were attempt to give it a degree of hardness as a subject. And I see the literary Darwinism, which, as we discussed before you started recording, we had a brief discussion about literary Darwinism. It's not a very powerful force within our discipline. It's really only a couple of figures, one of whom was Brian Boyd, another of whom was Joseph Carroll. But most of our discipline doesn't take it on. But they nonetheless are quite vocal critics of what they see as the loose, gestural, far too speculative, wayward, jargonistic field of theory. So they're kind of part of the anti-theory movement, and no doubt, and anti-critique too, but a very small and I think pretty uninfluential part. So that's to give some idea of the agons within the discipline itself. We then get another, just for returns to the first question about post-critique and how we define it. Another phrase that's come around recently is surface reading. Now, so it's allied to post-critique, but the thing about surface reading is, because there's been this in an introduction to special issue of representations, this phrase was used, and it starts becoming quite sticky that we've moved to an era of surface reading rather than deep reading or close reading. But by surface reading, they include some of the affective turn in the humanities, which we associate with post-critique, but they also include things like genetic criticism and those empirical. I mean, my problem with surface reading is that it kind of bundles critique and the legacies of criticism and scholarship together as a phrase, but nonetheless, it is a handle that you hear used around, that we have a new era of surface reading. So those are some of the agons within the humanities and within the discipline, and some of the conflicts which have a genealogy, which go back, and of course, one could argue it's a sign of health to have people arguing within this. Maybe they need to argue more. In some senses, I think they probably do, actually. But your other question, and then if you want me to keep going, I will go on and answer your other question about the more public and popular figures, like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris.
Yeah, sure.
Which is, I mean, it's a different question when there's a spillover. And of course, we should remember, if we're talking about literary studies, neither of those figures has his roots in literary studies. I mean, why has this come about? Well, I mean, I think the obvious reason why it come about and why there are huge challenges to the authority of the academy is because of the possibilities afforded by YouTube and the internet and people going on to them. Do the presence of those guys indicate something about the problems of critique? I mean, look, if you listen to, I think they're quite different. First of all, Sam Harris comes from an avowedly liberal tradition. He's liberal. He has time for evidence. He's time for science. He's very strongly atheistic. He's one of the four horsemen. And probably it's the case that his disposition, because there's probably a lot of anti-liberalism within certain strands of critical theory within the humanities.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-liberalism insofar as it opposes the idea of the individual as an active or autonomous or monadic agent.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be a strong sense in which that idea of liberal humanism doesn't get much shrift within certain very influential strands within the humanities.
Mm-hmm.
I think certainly within literary studies and cultural studies. I suspect much less so within history or philosophy. I expect there are far more liberals there. I think Jordan Peterson, well, I mean, it's a huge phenomenon, very hard to answer, and I'm only speculating as to what his popularity is. I suspect one of the reasons he's popular, though, is quite different from Sam Harris, and that is his openness to a concept which used to be very, very central to literary studies, namely meaning, or to give it another word, a sense of the numinous, or the sacred. I mean, the roots of English, and certainly we go, I mean, you mentioned Arnold. Arnold saw literature and the arts as stepping into the place evacuated by the traditional figure of a god who was dethroned or thrown into question or thrown into crisis by the developments of Victorian science. And Leavis in some ways saw that too, that literature in its, had a kind of a sacred element or a numinous element or an element which could uplift and introduce readers to higher values. I think, and perhaps even make life meaningful. I think as part of the excesses, if you like, or part of the move to denude and debunk of critique within literary studies is a severe skepticism about literature having that function. A severe and a desire, in fact, a strong motive to strip away any lingering notion of the sacral as politically problematic and dubious. I think that there's a big space for a figure like Peterson who's not a, I mean, I don't know, but I don't think he's certainly isn't an atheist like Harris. Yeah. I don't think he's a card-carrying Christian or anything like that, but he certainly addresses spiritual matters in his work explicitly. He's given a lot of readings of the Bible, his YouTube videos, I understand, but also he talks about meaning and purpose from a psychological point of view. And I think a lot of people were very dismissive of Jordan Peterson, but I think he is a very interesting and massive cultural phenomenon.
Thank you very much for the explanation. That was a great answer. You've actually answered many other questions that I had listed here. One was about Franco Moretti and his attempt to maybe scientize literature, which you covered, and also literary Darwinism as well.
Yeah.
So as a final question, given the current situation, I mean, with the new liberal economy and also the new managerial model of universities, and what Rita Fusky calls the fact that humanities are going through this legitimacy crisis. You did mention that literature always had this proper literary scholarship where there was a philology tradition. Is with this new climate, and there are a lot of graduates who may not be able to get a job in academia, to have the peace of mind to spend time doing that proper kind of scholar research. So where do you see the future of humanities and literary studies, say, in the next 10 years?
Look, I think it's a really good question, and I have to be, say straight up. I don't have any confidence in my predictions. That's what's going to happen in the next 10 years, because look what happened in 2020. We still have to understand the impact of that pandemic upon universities. And universities are remarkably conservative, including the humanities, in my opinion, despite the fact that they're full of very, very avowed radicals, in the humanities, lots of neo-Marxists, a lot of people who think they're very anti-system, but they presided over a system which is extraordinarily unmoving and unchanging. Think of the lecture. Lecture as a mode hasn't changed in 100 years. Yeah. The essay, the exam, it is I mean, after all, most academics are people who are too conservative to ever leave school. They've stayed in there all their lives. So I think that there is a strong change resistant in the DNA of the humanities. And to some extent, the elaborate theorizing is a compensation for an institutional sclerosis. That says that they have never, that said, a lot of people have predicted the universities will change or will be disrupted by neoliberalism, as well as a lot of our, you know, a lot of the problem is a lot of people say that the universities and the humanities have capitulated to neoliberalism and managerialism, and maybe that's so, but universities still manage to, I mean, we think of the US where a lot of these things start, manage to get a lot of students into a lot of debt and to give a lot of time to do something. One of the things they do, reason they do that is for accreditation. Another one is experience. Another one is knowledge. So there's three reasons: accreditation, experience, knowledge. In 2020, the experience one went because people weren't having the experience in the same way. People weren't having the experience of meeting their peers and making their connections. They were just having it on Zoom. The knowledge is not just for English, even though, I mean, and it was the implication of your question that, you know, what's the use of English? Well, knowledge for most disciplines is going to be, if we're thinking of knowledge as sort of preparing people for employment. I mean, but humanities have been making this argument for a long time, and I think it's a very makeable argument, actually, that that the skills of the future are unknown, even the near future, with the revolutions in technology and employment that are going on. So the best way to preparing someone for employment or work, if that's one of the roles of university, and it is only one of the roles, I would argue, not the whole role, the way it's some ways produced, is to kind of give them skills which are non-specific, give them critical skills. I think actually there is a role for the humanities to make that case strongly and say, you know, you can teach someone, train somebody to do a particular task like engineering, but we don't know what engineering is going to be. You know, in an era of quantum computing, and nor do we know the social impact. So we need people with great social skills and great critical skills. We can make those arguments to defend the humanities, and I think we should. I think probably, you know, even though I'm not confident about my predictions, in my view, the humanities should be making better links with the other faculties and with other disciplines. I think we should see ourselves as giving people skills that can go alongside more, you know, more vocational skills. I would say also that just and I know I'm once again kind of actually very broadly, but it seems to me that critique, which sees itself as a counter to neoliberalism and managerialism and that sort of hegemony, has often colluded with it over the last 20 or 30 years. I think that, for example, I mean, we can often find the unwitting parallels or echoes in the marketing that comes out of a university and some of the aims of critique. For example, the urge to be instrumental. Critique is always reading literature from an instrumentalist point of view. In other words, in the cause of emancipation, in the cause of political enlightenment, in the cause of making the world better, often from a neo-Marxist point of view, which is the same rhetoric that comes out of the vice chancellor. It's never, we're going to learn in order to change myself and work on myself as an individual, or really get deep understanding and enjoyment of these masterworks of our culture in order to live better and have a better perception and better empathy. And you know, those aren't the language that tends to come from critique. I think you also get a rhetoric of boundary breaking in critique. Critique is always very suspicious of the disciplines. And in fact, when that moment in the 80s late 80s, when critique really kind of came into the humanities, it was all about tearing down the humanities. It was about transdisciplinarity was the mode, because the boundaries were artificial, ideological, Western ways of dividing knowledge, which constrained our capacities to know and emancipate. Equally, a vice chancellor loves interdisciplinary talk. So a radical Marxist sociology lecture and a neoliberal vice chancellor will often coincide in their desire to get past disciplinary boundaries. In fact, if you really want to be original in a university, talk about in defense of disciplinarity. You're not going to get much funding if you say, I want to do a single disciplinary case. But actually, the truth is that disciplines are far more complex than simple restrictions we have to throw down. The whole rhetoric of paradigm breaking and novelty, very, very capitalist sort of a idea in which, Tim Cook reveals the new iPhone every year. I think we also got that within critique. It's within the literary studies. It's new fashions. It's charismatic stars. So I would argue that there are all types of ways in which literary studies reproduced the capitalist modes and ideologies which it sought ostensibly to renounce. So I don't see post-critique as being a capitulation to managerialism and neoliberalism. I think that there is really a space to push against instrumentalism of all kinds, to make a space for play, for openness, for living well, and in fact, not just kind of, all universities now have grand challenges. What's the grand social challenge? Make your work useful. In some ways, perhaps we need to, and this again, I point to Adorno, the founder of critique. The best way to kind of perhaps open paths to the truly novel and the new is to resist that dominance of instrumentality and use, and always getting pulled into a kind of a purposive utilitarian mindset. And perhaps the humanities can be a space for playfulness and openness and fun, and therefore provide an institution which can escape that endless, mindless drive forward.
I never thought about critique being convoluted with capitalism in that sense. So that was a very interesting take, and which is absolutely true, especially in literary studies.
It's a bit of a provocation, but I know many of my colleagues would have a lot to say that, and you can look, of course, at some of the hostility that Rita Filski's book was subject to. So there's a lot of anti-post critique amongst literary studies and the humanities generally, who see it as kind of, oh no, we're breaking our guard here. We're breaking our lines. We have to be this. Well, I mean, the lines have been demonstrably ineffective over the last 30 years, not just in changing society and introducing some revolution, but also in stopping universities from going the way they've gone. Protecting a precariat, protecting people from, people with the most radical politics, working alongside a growing adjunct staff. So I think that there are an awful lot of campus radicals living in a kind of self-flattering bubble of political efficacy, which flouts not just notional truth, but also observable truth over many decades.
Thank you very much, Ronan. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and there were lots and lots of great points to think about.
Well, also, and I kind of hesitate. I kind of would want to emphasize this to you and your listeners: provocations. So what I said should not all be agreed with. Feel free to push against it and disagree with it, because much of it will be unorthodox.
Thank you for your comment.
Okay, my pleasure.